When I was in 6th grade, I discovered Five Nights at Freddy's. Now, obviously at the time, I thought it was probably one of the more terrifying things that I had seen in my very short existence. But little did I know that this particular game would probably catalyze the increasing popularity of a current genre of media that bounces around YouTube and in video games today, being analog horror. Now, I'm not saying that this all of a sudden became some sort of genre and people are just now really getting around to it. It's been around for a number of years. But I'm just saying that FNAF probably had a good, or a great bit of deal of really boosting its popularity as a genre as a whole. Now naturally, because these forms of media operate underneath similar fashions, you're going to get similar traits between these pieces of work. And one of the more crucial parts of analog horror that I have found, or that I have personally noticed from looking at piece to piece, is the use of animation and the use of autoanthropomorphization. Now, whenever I say the word animation from here on out, please do know that I'm not talking about animation in the traditional sense, in which you have someone draw or program models into a moving cohesive piece that we use for entertainment. I'm talking about endowing something with life. You know, like how God kind of did with Adam back in the Bible. You know, that kind of animation. And then whenever I talk about autoanthropomorphization, I need to kind of clarify what I mean by that. Whenever someone talks about anthropomorphization in a sense of literature and when talking about media, we're simply referring to when a human being assigns an object that isn't human-like characteristics. So, for instance, this little alligator man that I'm using to talk to all of you through is a really good example of anthropomorphization for multiple reasons. One, alligators don't do this. You don't see them dressed up in a little set of glasses and a v-neck sweater and a nice little collar shirt underneath and, you know, hear it ramble on edge about whatever whim graces its brain. Instead, alligators, as you know, are little swamp gremlins that sleep in muck and dirty swamp water and eat fish or whatever. That's what alligators actually do. So it is me and the creativity of my sibling and combined has created this little alligator man thing that I can talk to you all through. Whenever I slap the prefix auto in front of the word anthropomorphization, what I am saying is that you have non-human entities trying to emulate human behavior by themselves. So instead of a human being giving something human-like characteristics, it's instead a non-human entity trying to mimic human-like processes and movement and behavior. I'll use some examples right here to show you what I mean. I'm going to use an example, or a few examples from Five Nights at Freddy's, and then some similar titles like the Walten Files to show what I mean by animation and autoanthropomorphization. And then use this as a medium to juxtapose other works to show how they do it as well. So in Five Nights at Freddy's, you basically have this guy whose name I can't remember, and I'm not going to care to remember, but the purple guy goes around, kills a couple of kids, and those kids' souls go around and repossess these animatronic suits to which they try to use in order to basically get their revenge upon the purple guy or whoever the hell they think is. So what you have is a soul, per se, being injected itself into a non-human form, the robots, and then going around and doing a human activity, killing someone. And then you also do have instances of animation in this sense, like with the marionette giving life to the kids in FNAF 2 in their animal suits and showing them how to animate a robot corpse, essentially. What you have here is that you have things, one being brought to life, the animation, and then it's autoanthropomorphization because these things are mimicking human behavior outside of direct human influence. To kind of take a step back, the reason why I'm qualifying this as autoanthropomorphization is because the players in this conflict aren't necessarily human beings at this point in time. They were previously human beings, yes, but because they aren't human now, they aren't human beings whenever they do it then. If that makes any sense at all. And that's why I'm qualifying it as autoanthropomorphization. And they're doing it themselves. They're having to relearn to remimic human behavior and eventually kill somebody. So, the same thing kind of goes with, to a degree, more particularly the animation element, and then with the Walten Files, particularly with Ed and Molly, right? Ed and Molly basically just haunt a rabbit and then go on and haunt a video game, essentially, after their Uncle Felix killed them in a car accident on accident. So what you have is a soul injecting itself into a non-human entity and then mimicking human behavior. Storytelling, namely. That's all that's really happening in the Walten Files, is you're being broadcasted a gut-wrenching story about a cover-up murder and assassination plots in an attempt to try and cover up one really bad mistake. So, for those reasons, like with FNAF, it does teeter on non-anthropomorphic behavior, but it is, in my opinion, still anthropomorphization to a certain degree, but most certainly animation. Now, instead of just categorizing things into either just simply being, is this animation or is this autoanthropomorphization, I'd like to take it a step further and actually talk about why or how this actually achieves something that can be called horror. And I think the best way we could do this is by looking at the consequences of either animating something or re-anthropomorphizing something. And what I've noticed is that you also get two results as well, at least from what I can tell. One of those is, simply put, horror in the similar, and then horror in the dissimilar, and then more times than not, a mix of those two. With the Walten Files and Five Nights at Freddy's, you get a good mixture of both. In FNAF, you get horror in the dissimilar because you're looking at robots with uncanny characteristics going out of their way and doing things that would be considered human, like killing somebody, right? You don't think of a Chuck E. Cheese going out of their way and killing somebody for sport or something like that, or for revenge, moreover. That's a very human thing to do, to kill someone out of revenge. It's not something that you'd see a robot intended for children's entertainment to do. But at the same time, because you know that there's this human element involved in there, you know that this is something that we as people are attuned to in our inherent natures. So it's a pretty common threat that just reemerges in your brain. It's a threat that you know well and that you understand as being a person, right? Revenge. It's something that you can relate to at a very basic level. And because of that, you get that nice overlap in between the two, where you have horror in similar actions, in the sense of the similarity coming in through the medium of the threat, and then the dissimilarity as in terms of the vehicle of the threat, the animatronic. You get something that is dangerously similar with the Walten Files, where you have, once again, the means of the threat being some sort of revenge murder, right? Something that we as human beings can relate to. And then you have the vehicle through which this action will be achieved, being anthropomorphic suits with robots and stuff. And that's the horror in dissimilarity element. Now, obviously, I think the horror of similarity comes a lot more in terms of, the disfigurement of the human face, which is uncomfortable, obviously. But I think it's also achieved in the general plot with those two parts, with the robots and with the means, certainly. Another piece of media, kind of moving away from the FNAF and Walten Files stuff, that has really gained some traction for its use of predominantly animation, it would definitely have to be Local 58. Now, I'm not too in tune with the lore of Local 58, so if there's some nerd out there that absolutely knows every little theory and every little nook and cranny about this series, please just go off. I'm giving you full permission to go off in the comments section. But the way I understand it is that Local 58 essentially just is a series of television tapes of one particular TV station over a period spanning decades, and its relationship with a malevolent force that uses the moon to drive mass hysteria into people. Now, as to what this malevolent force is, I've heard it theorized to be Satan and a few other things pertaining to the spiritual, but whatever this malevolent force has done, it's certainly done one thing, and that is, it has animated the moon into this living, breathing, eldritch abomination. In the skywatching clip, you get a nice close-up view of the surface of the moon, and it's moving, it's twitching, it's flowing almost. And then when you pull away from the camera, it moves hundreds of thousands of miles closer to the Earth, threateningly, and its shape has changed entirely. The moon in this series is a living object with some amount of intelligence at play as well. It certainly would match the requirement to use animation as a medium to achieve horror of the dissimilar in this sense. I do not think it reaches the definition of autoanthropomorphization. And the reason why is that the moon in this case did not achieve anthropomorphization through itself as a means, right? It was given this by some sort of outside force, because we can assume that up until this point the moon could not have been forever an eldritch abomination, right? It was at some point in the past, modern or eons and eons ago, just a floating rock tidally locked to the earth, right? Without mind, without thought, just there. Because it didn't gain this sentience by itself, but instead through the intelligence of a non-human entity, you just have animation at your hands, not some form of anthropomorphization. Now, someone could make the argument that what is happening in this story could be a form of anthropomorphization, because what you do have is the author of this piece, or the creator of this piece, endowing the moon, a non-living object, with some sort of acute human intelligence and with a will to subject the entire human race to its authority of sorts. Right? But I disagree on the basis of perspective and on how you're treating that. Ultimately, yes, everything that I'm talking about is a form of anthropomorphization, but I would like to keep the context inside of the plot of the story itself. So instead of looking at it from the outside in, I'm just keeping everything inside of the box. So if you were to be put directly inside of the story, it would just be some form of animation, because it would be a non-human entity, that malevolent force, giving a non-living entity its characteristics. They're not human characteristics, but its characteristics, its intelligence, its craving for power. Although those two things are definitely human characteristics, they are not exclusive to humanity. So for that reason, it's just simply going to fall underneath this use of animation to create horror of the dissimilar, and strictly the dissimilar, because it's not a human character, it's not a human intelligence that we can relate to. It's not the same craving for power that we're used to. Right? Whenever we want a power for a certain reason. We don't know why this being wants power the way it does. Its motivations are different and most certainly unknown. Another series on the internet that uses this idea of a living planet is Gemini Home Entertainment. And I got to watch this one recently and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But Gemini Home Entertainment does a lot of these two categories that I'm talking about. Namely, since we're still talking about the planets, I just kind of want to emphasize that one for a little bit. And it's pretty similar to what happens in Local 58. In Gemini Home Entertainment, what we have is aliens basically turning their planets into living, breathing piles of flesh, just kind of floating through space. And that in itself is quite unnerving, right? It would be, once again, animation because it's this non-human force, as shown by the photographs in that video, transforming their planets into a living pile of flesh. So that would create horror of the dissimilar in this sense, because you don't think of planets as being living like you did the moon in Local 58, and moreover, you don't ever think of them as having fleshy arteries and hearts and organs and beings living inside of them like little symbiotic parasites. It's uniquely, and no pun intended, but it is uniquely alien in terms of the way it manifests itself in horror. Now, as for the animation part and autoanthropomorphization, this is where it gets interesting. Because in some of the videos what you see they're kind of like instructional tapes on how to break into somebody's home and then turn a person either as some sort of vessel for your own benefit, and the benefit really isn't necessarily explained, but that's okay, I love ambiguity. But what you get is these creatures which are only really referred to as nature's mockery. Get down to size, and they take human beings and they probe them, and they basically turn them into they zombify them to a certain degree, in the sense that you have a parasite taking over the brain and trying to mimic the person until they don't need to mimic that person anymore, and they can turn them into some sort of food resource, which is all I'm really guessing what the hell's going on with that giant red heap of flesh, which is so terrifying. But anyway, this would have to be autoanthropomorphization, because you have a non-human entity trying to mimic human behavior. We see this several times. We get one shot of a guy walking around in the field just screaming, and then you have the fake people moving their jaws in this ugly manner. It's all unnerving, and they walk around like people too. So they're trying to present this facade of humanity until they don't need to anymore. And that would create horror in the similar, because you're looking at something that should be human for all intents and purposes, but it isn't at its core. It's just trying to pretend to be a person. The last series that I want to talk about in regards to autoanthropomorphization and animation is the Mandela Catalog. And the Mandela Catalog uses autoanthropomorphization almost exclusively. Now, for those of you not attuned to the story of the Mandela Catalog, it's essentially a detailing of events that transpire in this little county called Mandela County in somewhere USA and its sister counties, where they are essentially facing a threat from this otherworldly force of beings who come in and try to mimic people, and they get them to kill themselves through psychological torment in order to essentially replace them. There's a lot more biblical lore in there that I'm not going to delve into because it's kind of crazy and complex, and that could be a video in and of itself, and I'd love to do one in the future of it because it's such a well thought out piece. But just to keep things pithy here, what we have here are non-human entities, demons, or some sort of interdimensional force or thing, or things rather, opening up some sort of unseen portal, probably through televisions somehow, and attempting to mimic people. And we actually get screenshots of these things in the series itself. You get them as doppelgangers that look identical to other people. You get them as though they are biologically impossible, with heavily contorted figures and characteristics that you can point out on the spot. And then you even have the intruders, the one that looks like Dream, that, pop up every once in a while in the corners of your room. So these beings are intentionally trying to act like people in order to replace them. And that creates, most definitely, horror of the similar as a result of that. Because you have things that ought to be people but really aren't. And that unnerves us. There's something so fundamental about the human psyche, and seeing something that looks so similar to a person but isn't in such a way that it just completely and totally frightens us. But other than that, it would most certainly use autoanthropomorphization in this context, and it uses it probably the best out of any of these series. It does use some element of animation, as that's hinted at in the series. In particular, there was one scene where you have police officers putting in a camera into someone's home who had supposedly been attacked by an intruder, and you see a big blacked out spot on the camera of someone's corpse is supposedly being manipulated in a grotesque manner. And obviously you have instances of like Caesar being mimicked by an intruder to go and get his friend killed. Those would be some good examples within that series of showing both animation and then autoanthropomorphization. I do believe with that will cover it as to what I wanted to really talk about and share with you guys, what I thought it was interesting. I know sometimes my ramblings might not be as organized as I'd like them to be, but nonetheless I do hope that you found this video interesting. I would like to say thank you in advance for almost 3,000 subscribers. At the time that I'm making this, we're at like 2.94k. It's inching closer and closer, and I'm really thankful for all the support that you guys have given me throughout this time on YouTube, and I'm glad you still continue to like my content. I'm sorry that my content has been pretty sparse as of late because of school. I have had to stay up so late, pretty much night after night, and it's been really difficult. But recently I've been able to make myself just enough time to come out here and make a video for you guys. So I do hope you guys enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe and share if you liked it. If you didn't like it, tell me why. If I missed something or I said something incorrect in terms of the lore or the story, or if you have your own thoughts, please leave them down there below. I love to see what you guys have to think. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you all for watching, and I will get back with you guys soon.